and group that ad hoc built up for this evening. So,
Can you do introduction?
yeah, would you like to tell us who is from where, what's the main course of studies of interest?
Okay. So I'm Julia, and I'm 73, and I'm here because occurred, like I said earlier, and I think that is very important topic of your presentation.
You're a graduate, doctoral student in history, or
I'm a student on the
student in history? Great.
Yeah.
Thanks for coming.
I study history too, and anthropology, cultural anthropology, and I interested and history of sport and theory of history. It's all, I think. Yeah.
Thanks for coming.
Hi, Slavik. I studied sociology and Slavic philology. I'm focused on Balkan studies in general.
Okay.
So,
Any particular part to the whole?
main special ex-Yugoslavia, so
Okay.
all countries, memories are.
Dobrodošli. Sloven, hrvatský, skandinávský, i světové jazyky, uglavnom.
I'm Piotr, and I'm research assistant at the Institute of Slavonic Studies here in Krakow. And I'm finishing a small project about commemorative street names in Croatia, Slovenia. So the issues of memory in ex-Yugoslavia are really present to me.
And this talk will deal with Croatia. So thanks for coming to both of you.
So I'm very happy that we have this set of socialization from anthropology through history to Balkan studies, and I hope this introduction will help us simply talk after the lecture. If someone from the online audience would like to introduce himself, herself, themselves. Hi. Anyone?
Is anyone out there? Thanks for coming.
So let's hope they join us actively during after the talk, and I feel like we might slowly get started. So Ola, perhaps you introduce yourself. Let's be democratic.
Right, so my name is Alexandra, and at this project, so potential histories of Central Eastern Europe, I'm a coordinator mostly, but the main part of my research is related to 20th century Polish literature, so mostly the works of Witold Gombrowicz and Bruno Schulz in the context of affect studies in the humanities, but also memory studies, especially memory about Gombrowicz, who lived in Argentina for around 25 years, and current Ukrainian memory about Bruno Schulz in the context of war, but also of current Russian invasion. So, and I'm really glad to be there. I also studied Slavic studies, but Czech language, but this field is also related to ex-Yugoslavia, so it's a field of my research. So I'm really glad to hear. Thank you.
Great.
So I will only show briefly that Roma Syndyka working here at the Polish Studies Department and specializing in memory studies, Holocaust studies, and I'm most interested in bystander studies recently, and that's perhaps enough of me. I'm very happy to be the member of the Research Center for Memory Cultures, and I do appreciate this new year that actually formed me, and I'm very happy to work with the colleagues that are with us online and here in the room. And I will introduce our guest for tonight, and well, we met. We realized we came across your book, and this is how we started this adventure with your research. Somewhere in 2016, when Research Center for Memory Culture started a project on uncommemorated sites, and we came across the book that brings us together, and so the 2016 Violence as Generative Force, Identity, Nationalism, and Memory in Balkan Community. And when we realized that there's someone who thinks along our lines and actually already published that what we need to voice. So we were like faithful followers of your study. And we will hear as a template the follow-up of this project, and we probably also encourage to talk a bit about the previous one. So Max Bergholz is a historian professor in the history department at Concordia University in Canada, the university that we quite often work with, originally from Pittsburgh. And then you finish your PhD around distance. So you need to come at some point, and now you're of fifth grade at the Concordia. So it's the professorship in genocide and human rights.
It's just professor's history.
So in this first book that we were so inspired by, got so many prizes that it's it leaves everyone simply jealous, and things like that. Nothing else to say. So the University of Notre Dame, and then European Studies Book Award, awarded by Council for European Studies by Cornell University. So this is really big. And American Historical Association, even bigger, and Canadian Association of Slavists. So both historians, European studies scholars, and Slavic scholars appreciated the research that was very original and going against the current. So it was really impressive that you made it and came through those barriers and blockages that usually stand in front of a young scholar that tries to say something new. So I'm very eager to hear what's new on your table, and the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. That was a really kind and generous introduction. Thank you to everyone for coming tonight, whoever is out there. Thank you for being here. And also just another thank you for inviting me. It's a great honor to hear that my book, before we even met something to you and your team here, and then to make this connection. This is what we hope for when we do scholarship, that the work that we write goes into the world and means something to people. So to me, it's a great honor to be here. It's my first time in Poland. Beautiful city. It's been an amazing trip so far. So thank you. So tonight is really a new step out for me. Not just because it's my first time in Poland, but it's the first time I'm going to present a story that I want to try and tell in my second book, and which I hope to write in the next few years. And so before I tell you the outline of that story, and why I think it has meaning for us today, I want to recount to you how I stumbled upon this story. So I want to begin tonight with a story of how I came to this story. And so this takes us back to a very dreary December afternoon. The light was very similar to what we see today, where it almost seems dark. In December 2005, so nearly 20 years ago, I was in Zagreb, in Croatia, and I found myself on that afternoon sitting almost entirely alone in the Croatian State Archive reading room, which is gigantic. The only staff person there was falling asleep at her desk. She was kind of dozing in and out of consciousness. And I had spent nearly the entire day slowly going through folders for the Communist Party's Veterans Organization, which was formed in 1947. And among its central tasks, according to the president of Yugoslavia, who was also the president of this organization, that is Josip Broz Tito, the organization had the goal of remembering, quote, to use Tito's words, everything we are proud of, while also forgetting everything that we are not proud of. And I was looking that day for a local case study to research where I might discover something new about how villagers or residents of a small town struggle to either remember or forget aspects of the massive intercommunal violence which occurred in this part of Europe between 1941 and 1945, which was known while Yugoslavia, socialist Yugoslavia, still existed as the People's Liberation War, or what today we would simply call the Second War. The light was getting more dim that day. The sun was going down behind Zagreb's apartment blocks. I had spent the entire day reading what were basically really boring documents. They were produced during the 1950s and 1960s about monument building exercises and efforts, I should say, by the Veterans Organization. And like most days of my historical research in archives, I had devoted significant time and effort in my search for useful materials. And by the end of the day, I had found nothing of interest. And so the archive was about to close, and I looked at the last few folders, and I wasn't really sure I had anything in me left to read. Instead of packing up to leave, I grabbed one more folder, and I scanned the typed pages. And as I was reading what was written, I froze on several paragraphs that were written on February 12th, 1963. They were completely different from anything else I had read that day. The letter writer's name was Adam Petrovich Gigac, and he lived in a small Croatian town that I had never heard of. And the place was called Glina. Let's try this. Here. Okay, the place was called Glina, which you can see here on the map, which I later discovered was only about an hour and a half bus ride away from Zagreb. Petrovic Gigac wrote about a massacre that had taken place in his town during the summer of 1940. Local Croatian nationalists known as Ustašas had brought scores of Serbian Orthodox peasants from nearby villages to the town's Orthodox church. And inside that church, they had killed most of them. Not long after, the Ustašas demolished the church. And yet, in spite of the massive efforts by the communist authorities to build monuments to many of those killed between 1941 and 1945, this place in Glina, where the Orthodox Church had once stood, was empty in 1963. Petrovic Gigac indicated in his letter that a new Serbian Orthodox Church had been built only a few months earlier, but at a different location. His letter seemed to be a stark warning to the communist authorities about the need for an urgent reorientation about how this event in Glina during 1941 needed to be remembered. And so he wrote, quote, "As long as the site stands empty, where a massacre of that magnitude took place, as is the case with the slaughter in Glina's Orthodox Church, it will serve as permanent growth for chauvinism," end quote, or ethnic conflict. In place of this silence, he recommended a new approach. In his words, every act toward memorializing the site of the church would reduce, if not eliminate, the basis for the growth of political problems of an ethnic nature, end quote. So for him, the lack of a memorial on the site had become a political problem. And the ongoing lack of effort to build a memorial would only bring further, again in his words, political and moral problems, as well as other negative repercussions. As I was reading these words that afternoon in the archive, my sense of exhaustion and boredom quickly dissipated and was replaced with a physical sensation of electricity pulsating through my body. I couldn't sit down, I stood up. I walked around. And I had a profound sense that I had stumbled upon the faint outlines of a dramatic story of horrific violence and then deafening silence, which had lasted for decades. It seemed to me that there was an important story trapped in these short paragraphs of the letter written by Petrovic Gigac, which had been waiting to be uncovered and told. Not long after this moment of discovery, I woke up on another December morning that was equally dreary. I took a packed tram to Zagreb's central bus station. I maneuvered through throngs of people coming in and out of the city, puffing on cigarettes as they waited for their buses and buying bread and sandwiches for their trips. I bought a ticket to a place I'd never been to, Glina. The waiting lines for the bus going to that place were deserted, unlike that for most other locations. And once my bus pulled into the stations, I was nearly alone on that bus. After we arrived at Glina's tiny and nearly deserted bus station, I disembarked and made my way through the town center, where I barely encountered anyone. I was in search of the site of the old Orthodox church that Petrovich Gigac had written about in his 1963 letter. The address I was looking for was number 10 on the street called Stepan I Anton Bradic, named after two brothers who had been father figures of the Croatian national peasant movement during the 1920s. Many of the buildings along the way were abandoned, like this one. This was taken during a later trip, so it looks not like December, but more like summer. I noticed what looked like a brand new and very large Catholic church. And as I walked on, I could see the steeple of the new Orthodox church reaching for the sky, which Petrovich Gigac noted in his 1963 letter, which was located on a street 1 block away from the main street through town, where the original church had stood before the massacres of 1940. And then I arrived to the place where the old Orthodox church had once stood. I stared at an unimpressive, geometrically constructed building, which looked like it had been built sometime during the second half of the 20th century. I noted the sign above the building's main doors, which read Knjižnica I Čitaonica, or library and reading. And as I got closer, I noticed the flags. A large Croatian flag was flying in the center of the building, and under it were the words Hrvatski dom, or Croatian house. I stood and I stared. Here was a place, I thought, where a Serbian Orthodox church once stood, and where extreme Croatian nationalists massacred those whom they categorized as Serbs inside their own place of worship. And I wondered to myself, how is it possible that this place is called the Croatian house? And as I pondered this question, I wondered how today in Glina, there is nothing at this place that recalls the traumatic violence of 1941 that Petrovich Gigac wrote about with such profound urgency in 1963. This scene is even more striking today, 19 years after my first visit to Glina, especially after the application of a fresh coat of paint applied to the building in recent years, and the painting of even larger letters, which seem to spell out almost loudly, Croatian house, Hrvatski dom. This place continues to trigger questions about the past among those who, like me in 2005, come to Glina in search of traces of the town's traumatic history of violence in 1940. These moments during the cold and dimly lit days of December 2005, first in the reading room of the Croatian State Archive, and then on the deserted streets of Glina, marked, in retrospect, my point of departure to uncover this history. I took a long detour of nearly a decade once I discovered another local story of violence and silence in Bosnia, which became the subject of my first book, which Roma mentioned, Violence as a Generative Force, which I published in 2016. But I never forgot this story of Glina. And it is to that story that I'm now returning in my research. And I've completed a significant amount of research about the violence of 1941 in this town and the subsequent decades of communist rule, largely until the end of the 1960s. But more work awaits me in the coming years, especially on the period of communist decline from the 1970s through 1990, and then on the war in this region, fought between Serb rebels and the police and military of the newly independent Republic of Croatia, which began in 1991 and lasted until 1995. And then, on the reconquest of this era, by the Croatian army in August 1995, and finally on the years between that event and today. The mysterious history of Glina, which caught my eye in the archive and left me perplexed during my first visit to the town nearly 20 years ago, can be sketched out more fully through a series of scenes, which I'd like to describe. The question of how these scenes are connected and why I think they matter to us today is something that I'll discuss at the end of the lecture. So let's begin the story. The first scene takes us to the town of Glina nearly 85 years ago, during the first half of May 1940. Green leafy trees line Glina's main street. The air in the town's largest park, which is located just beyond the Orthodox Church, which you see here on the right, was fragrant with the smell of spring flowers. Local residents of different Christian faiths, some Catholic, some Orthodox, with the former usually seeing themselves as Croats, and the latter as Serbs, generally interacted in peace in their shared markets, bakeries, schools, parks, hospitals, and all of the other places that made up their daily lives. Up to the middle of May 1941, no historian would be able to find any evidence of mass interethnic violence among these people in Glina and its wider region. But there were individuals in Glina with more extremist views, and they had unexpectedly come to power over the lives of all of the town's residents during the previous month, which witnessed the Axis invasion of the Kingdom of Yugoslavia and the establishment of the independent state of Croatia under the leadership of Ante Pavelić and his Ustaša movement. He and his associates, some of whom lived in Glina, wanted to create a pure Croatian nation state that would be free of all people whom they defined as non-Croats. In Glina, this meant that those whom the Ustašas viewed as Orthodox Serbs were now to be targeted for elimination. Days later, on the night of May 12, 1941, this small, peaceful town would transform into a site of mass murder. On that night, local Ustašas, supported by others who had arrived in buses, went from house to house, where they arrested all male Serbs between the ages of 16 and 60. This group was taken the next evening, on May 13, to a nearby village. And it was there that the Ustašas murdered nearly all of them. 388 victims, Glina's residents, except one who managed to escape. His name was Nikola Samardzija, and he was one of Glina's shoemakers. He had also enjoyed playing soccer with his Catholic and Orthodox neighbors and friends. We can only imagine the terror and anguish that the mothers, wives, sisters, aunts, and grandmothers, and children of those killed lived with in the days following this massacre. When the victims never returned home, the Ustašas coldly told these women that their loved ones had simply been sent to Germany for work. This mass violence then ceased for the next 2 months, and then it exploded again after the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union on June 22nd, 1941. Only days later, local communist-oriented insurgents launched an attack on a train station not far from Glina. In response, the Ustašas unleashed a wave of terror against the region's Serbian population, whom they associated with the insurgents. In one of their so-called cleansing actions, they arrested about 400 Serb men, whom they brought to Glina, where they locked them inside the town's Orthodox Church. On the night of July 29th and into the early morning hours of July 30th, they shot about 300 of these prisoners inside that church. 2 men survived, and it's thanks to their post-war testimonies that we know something about this midsummer night when Glina's Orthodox Church transformed from a place of religious worship into a site of mass murder. Less than a week passed before the killing resumed. Under the pretense that their lives would be spared if they converted from Orthodoxy to Catholicism, as many as 2,000 Serb peasants from nearby villages were brought to Glina's Orthodox Church on the morning of August 4th. Instead of the Catholic priests they expected to meet for their life-saving religious conversion, they were greeted by Yugoslavia. Once again, Glina's Orthodox Church was used as a place for killing. The precise number of victims remains disputed among researchers, but the figure is thought to be somewhere between 1,000 to 1,165. Witnesses who passed by the church during these days and those that followed recalled that under the front door of the church, blood slowly flowed. 1 week later, on August 12th, the Ustashas in Glina gave the order for this church to be demolished. And in a matter of days, the site became what the poet Ivan Lalic would later call place of wind, where the church once stood. Here's a photograph from 1947, which can give us a sense of what inspired Lalic to write these words in the mid-1950s. The communists ultimately defeated the Ustashas in 1945, along with the occupying Axis powers who had invaded and dismembered the Kingdom of Yugoslavia in 1941. Already during the war, the communists had begun their work of reconstituting Yugoslavia as a new socialist state with a federal structure, in which all officially recognized nations and nationalities would be equal. One of the cornerstones of their socialist revolution was the claim that the citizens of the Yugoslav lands had joined together during the war in what they called brotherhood and unity, and they had fought together to liberate their country. This supposed forging of brotherhood and unity meant that national questions and the recent episodes of mass interethnic violence, like what took place in Glina in 1941, were now to be thought of after 1945 as belonging to the past, not something in the present and future. While this may have sounded powerful at the level of political rhetoric, it created the basis for strange, disturbing, and deafening silences about the recent violence in places like Glina. Let's return again to the site of the former Orthodox Church and consider another scene from the post-war period. And let's ask what this place looked like as the communists went about claiming that the memory of the massacres of 1941 could be addressed with constant declarations about brotherhood and unity. This photograph was taken in the 1950s, and it raises many questions about the daily experience of living in the shadow of interethnic violence and the state-sanctioned imperative to remain silent about it. The place where Glina's Orthodox Church had once stood was a silent witness to the horrible instances of mass killing in that town during 1941. Yet from the time of those killings onward, there was nothing there that recalled these events. The site was to remain empty until the late 1960s. What did the relatives of the victims killed in Glina's Orthodox Church think as they walked past this site? Did they feel that the church needed to be rebuilt? Did they want a monument built in memory of their loved ones who had been massacred inside it? What did the few survivors of the massacres think as they gazed at this site, where their neighbors had tried to kill them in July and August 1941? And what about those who profited in some way or another from the massacres? What did they think as they took their strolls past this site to and from the city's main park? Did they recall how some of them had used stone from the church to build their own homes? Did they whisper about those neighbors who helped dig the mass graves where the victims' bodies had been dumped? Did they recall those who had plundered those bodies before they were buried? The new communist leaders of Glina were acutely aware that despite their rhetoric of brotherhood and unity, the violent past that they had chosen to silence was, in fact, still right there where it had taken place in 1941. They were aware that this silence could be broken in a community where the scars of the recent violence remained thin and easily torn. During the last years of the 1940s, local Serbian peasants, in collaboration with representatives of the Serbian Orthodox Church, took it upon themselves to search for and locate many of the mass graves where the victims had been buried. Once they found a number of them, they gathered together their agricultural tools. They loaded them into their horse-driven carts, and they drove to the site, where they began digging. Soon they located the remains of many of those who had been killed, which they began collecting. They planned to bury them in Glina's Orthodox cemetery. Their physical labor of excavating human remains was a deeply emotional and understandably upsetting experience. On several occasions, as those who unearthed the victims' remains returned from their work with their carts full of bones, they passed through Croatian villages. Sometimes Serb peasants who were driving the carts yelled out to the Croatian villagers, one day they would be killed and dumped into the same graves. The communist authorities were aware of these destabilizing confrontations. And so, perhaps we should not be surprised that they chose to do nothing with the site of the Orthodox Church. Their vision of brotherhood and unity had no space for recalling the past with massacres perpetrated by neighbors against neighbors. They explicitly prohibited the rebuilding of a new Orthodox church at this site. And they did so out of a fear that a new church would become a shrine to the Serbian victims of the 1941 massacres, and as such would become a place that would incubate a sense of interethnic victimization and thus generate nationalism and potential interethnic conflict. Our next scene takes us to a hilltop in Glina, perhaps only a 20-minute walk just beyond the site you see here in the photo. If we could walk there today, we would pass by a series of mostly abandoned buildings before arriving to a set of stairs made out of cement. They would lead us upward under a canopy of trees toward the sky. Before arriving to the summit of the hill, if we glance to the right, we would see gravestones. And soon it would become clear that we had arrived to Glina's Orthodox cemetery. This was the place where, in 1951, the communist authorities permitted the burial of the victims' remains. No individual victim was ever identified. Instead, all the remains were placed in a single grave. The inscription on the grave was simple, but it told some important facts about what happened in 1941. So now I'll just read part of that inscription. Here lie the innocent victims of the terrible slaughter which the Ustasha evildoers carried out in the summer of 1941 in the service of the fascist occupiers, during which they killed, in horrific ways, more than 2,000 sons and daughters of the Serbian people. By confining this site of memory to the cemetery of the Serbian Orthodox Church, the communist authorities attempted to ensure that this memory had little to no potential to stir up interethnic conflict. It was, after all, highly unlikely that any non-Serbs would enter this space where local Serbs mourned their dead. And as such, the 1951 mass grave and the ongoing emptiness at the site of the former Orthodox Church in the center of town helped to physically enshrine a wider public silence about Glina's history of violence in 1940. But the local communist authorities were not the only ones in Glina with ideas about how to remember the violent past. Although they prohibited a new Orthodox church from being built, where 2 of the 3 massacres in 1941 had taken place, they also approved the request by the Serbian Orthodox Church to construct a new church in Glina, only a few hundred meters away, at a site that the church owned. Volunteers worked tirelessly during the first years of the 1960s to build the new church, whose doors were officially opened on September 21st, 1963. Mood that day was festive, and the late summer air was warm. Hundreds of people came from nearby towns and villages. They gathered at long tables where they ate and drank and sang until late in the evening. If we could walk inside the newly constructed church, we would encounter a scene, which was for some perhaps unexpected, but also perhaps predictable. Confirming the fears of the local communist authorities, those who constructed the new church built inside of it a special altar in memory of the 1941 victims. A stone from the site of the demolished church was brought and placed inside a chest and placed on this altar. Church members went to the site of the old church and filled a bottle with what they called blood-soaked earth. The victims were referred to, as you can see on the left, as Serbian martyrs or Srpski mučenici. No part of the altar stressed any aspect of the communist ideology of brotherhood and unity. It was a place constructed to mourn and remember Serbian victims killed in 1940. 3 months after the festive opening of the new Orthodox Church in Glina, Adam Petrovich Gigas sat down at his desk and wrote the letter, which I discovered on that dreary day in 2005 in Zagreb. First time I heard of Glina. In his letter, Petrovich Gigas explained that the opening of this church, combined with the ongoing emptiness of the site where the 1941 massacres had taken place, had now created a problem with a political character. With the Serbian Orthodox Church now attempting to seize control over the memory of the victims, Petrovich Gigas argued that the vacant site would now serve as a permanent source for the growth of chauvinism. What would soon happen in Glina was something unthinkable only a few years earlier. Communist authorities would now completely change their position that they had previously maintained in the previous decades, where the site was left empty. Now, because of this challenge from the Serbian Orthodox Church, they declared that a memorial would now be built on the site where the old church had stood. And this brings us to our next. Almost 6 years after the opening of the new Serbian Orthodox Church, on July 4th, 1969, a large crowd gathered for the opening of what was called, as you can see here on the right, the Spomen Dom, or the Remembrance House. This modern structure had been constructed during the previous few years on the site of the old church. The date for its opening had no connection with the 3 waves of massacres in 1941. July 4th was a holiday celebrated in socialist Yugoslavia as Veterans Day, which was a day that celebrated the heroism of the multi-ethnic group of partisan fighters who came together during the years 1941 to 1945 to liberate their country and to establish socialist Yugoslavia. This choice of date tells us something about how the communist authorities sought to distance the Remembrance House from the actual history of interethnic violence in Glina, even as they sought to build a memorial on the site where much of that violence had been perpetrated. In speeches given that day, high-level politicians like Miko Trepalo generally referred to the victims not as Serbs, which was the reason why they were killed, but rather described them in non-ethnic terms as innocent victims. Tripolo's message that day was a vigorous effort to reframe the memory of 1941 away from being a shocking episode of inter-ethnic violence between neighbors and toward being a reason to focus attention on the constant cultivation of brotherhood and unity. So just a few of his words that day. Quote, in front of this remembrance house, we must take an oath to develop the brotherhood and unity of our peoples, especially of Serbs and Croats, to protect their full equality and energetically oppose all attempts to destroy it, regardless of whether such tendencies come from Croatian or Serbian nationalists. End quote. There was a sculpture placed in front of the remembrance house of a mother and child. You can see it here. Even though the victims of the massacres in the church were all male. A plaque, which was no longer visible when I took this photo, but a plaque in 1969 placed next to the sculpture was carved in Latin letters rather than Cyrillic, even though the latter was and is the script used by the Serbian Orthodox Church, as well as many local residents in this region who would have described themselves as Serbs. Its inscription was notable for its use of language, which obscured who was killed and who did the killing in 1940. The inscription read, 1,200 innocent people found death inside the church by the blade of the Ustasha knife. End quote. If anyone had gathered that day for the opening of the Remembrance House, if anyone gathered that day for the opening of the Remembrance House did not know the history of violence in Glina during 1940, this plaque would not have helped very much to clarify what exactly took place during that tragic year. No relatives of the victims were invited to speak at the opening of the Remembrance House. No representatives of the Serbian Orthodox Church were invited, which was certainly intentional by the communist authorities. After all, part of their reason for constructing this site of memory was to reassert control over the memory of 1941, which the Serbian Orthodox Church had taken in 1963. After a short period of what appears to have been a certain level of satisfaction among many residents in Glina that at least some form of remembrance had finally been built on the site of the demolished church, various criticisms began to surface. The Remembrance House was a memorial, but was also a building designed with a significant level of social functionality. It included space inside for children to play games and for young people to dance. There was also a space for showing films. Letters were written in which some people expressed anguish and anger that such activities were permitted on a site where so many people had been murdered in 1940. There was a debate over the number of victims which appeared on the plaque in front of the Remembrance House. Some local Croats claimed that the number of 1,200 was an exaggeration. Some local Serbs said the number was too low. Some people felt the adjective Croatian needed to be placed in front of the word Ustaš. Some felt that the rubric used for the victims, innocent people, needed to simply be replaced with Serbs. Some wanted the phrase, the victims found death, changed to the Ustašas slaughtered. Taken together, the criticisms made in the years which followed the opening of the Remembrance House amounted to an indictment of its capacity to function as an effective site of memory in the eyes of many residents in Glina. For these people, this place neither reflected the desires of the victims nor conveyed a sufficient degree of historical truth about what had taken place in 1940. And this unsettled atmosphere during the aftermath of the opening of the Remembrance House continued through the 1970s and into the 1980s. And this discontent among many with how they perceived the Remembrance House to fail to memorialize the violence and victims of 1941 crystallized in the mid-1980s with the formation of a council to renovate the memorial. And this council was composed of 5 members, all of whom had personal links to this region. One was a historian. One was a painter. One was a sculptor. One was a director of a nearby archive, and the other a director of a nearby memorial complex. And they met numerous times during the second half of the 1980s, and they discussed and debated various approaches. On one hand, the council's members envisioned various proposals which sought to transform the Remembrance House into a more historically accurate and emotionally evocative site of memory to the mass violence in Glina. On the other hand, some of the proposals were seen by many members of the communist authorities as a direct challenge to the imperative for war memorials to first and foremost cultivate brotherhood and unity. And we can appreciate that dynamic when we examine a model that was proposed by 2 of the council's members for renovating the site. The members were Dragan Čuprić, who was the painter, and Momčilo Krković, who was the sculptor. They created a model for a special remembrance room to be constructed inside the Remembrance House. And as you can see, the floor of this room was to be painted red, which was to be a powerful reminder to all who would enter that hundreds of people had been killed inside the church, with their blood having covered the floor in late July and early August 1941. If we look at the painting in the front, it showed a partially destroyed church, along with the heads of victims on the floor and knives, which were used for decapitation. And the words we see here written in Cyrillic say, "The truth is written in our blood." And if we go back to the previous picture, the 2 plaques, which unfortunately are not clear if I zoom in on them, they were to include the testimony of one of the Ustashas who was captured when he was interrogated, and he explained what it was like to participate in the killings. So a firsthand testimony. The painting on the left depicted rows of local Serbs, including an Orthodox priest, some of whom had their hands bound. They are waiting to be converted from Orthodoxy to Catholicism, which is how the Ustashas promised that their lives would be spared. And they wait in this painting, not knowing they are about to be killed. The painting on the right shows a woman expressing immense grief and sorrow as she stands over a sea of bodies. Outside the Remembrance House, this plan recommended that the sculpture of the woman and child be taken away, and it be replaced, and the plaque should also be taken away. The entrance of the plaza in front of the building, this sculpture would replace what had been placed there in 1969, which would symbolize the entrance of the old demolished church. And on either side of the plaza, which led to the entrance of the building, there would be long rows of plaques, which would contain the first and last names of all of the victims and the age when they were killed. So to give you an example of what those are to look like. These sorts of suggestions certainly can be seen as emanating from a powerful desire by council members and the others who supported their work to remember Glina's violent past in a way that, in their view, better reflected key historical and emotional truths from 1940. Yet, we can also appreciate how these kinds of proposals held the capacity to potentially ignite tensions and conflicts in a multi-ethnic community, especially one in a state like Yugoslavia during the second half of the 1980s, which was beset by significant economic difficulties and growing levels of elite-level nationalism. If these sorts of changes to the Remembrance House were to be implemented, what effect might they have on relationships among Glina's residents? How would those who saw themselves as Serbs, thus connected in some way or another with the victims of 1941, feel about these changes? And how would those who saw themselves as Croats, and thus often associated in one way or another with the perpetrators, react to these kinds of changes? We'll never know answers to those questions. Before the changes could be approved and implemented to the Remembrance House in Glina, Yugoslavia began to break apart. The Republic of Slovenia declared independence from the Yugoslav Federation at the end of June 1991, and so too did the Republic of Croatia. In the preceding year, the League of Communists lost its political monopoly. In Croatia, replacing the communists were a host of political parties, the most powerful of which were organized along nationalist lines. In Glina, as in other parts of Croatia where Serbs were counted in high numbers, there was a very strong desire among those who called themselves Serbs to remain in Yugoslavia. And so most of them supported the newly formed Serbian Democratic Party. Yet once the Croatian nationalists in the political party called the Croatian Democratic Union began moving in the direction of declaring independence from Yugoslavia, these Serb nationalists in Croatia, like their colleagues elsewhere in Croatia, took up arms and unilaterally declared their own parastate, which they called the Serb Autonomous Region of Krajina. In doing so, they brought memories of 1941 into sharp focus as they prepared during late 1990 and early 1991 to engage in violence against their Croat neighbors. The new coat of arms they designed, with a text in both Serbian and English, tells us clearly how they viewed 1941 as a basis and justification for their actions in 1990, as well as how they intended to communicate this message to an international audience of UN peacekeepers who arrived in Croatia that year, 1991, in an attempt to manage the war that had exploded. In this image, we can take note of an understudied aspect of memory politics. It is often thought that the breaking of silences about the traumatic past, which more nationally minded Serbs in Glina had been trying for decades to accomplish about the 1941 massacres, will provide a basis for truth telling, and thus can help provide a basis for intergroup reconciliation. Yet in Glina, the opportunity that the collapse of communism presented to tell a more complete truth about 1941 resulted in a context in which nationalists and memory activists chose to use traumatic memories to mobilize people for a new wave of violence. It's worth noting that on July 26, 1991, a day, or the day, I should say, when Serb rebels completed their violent takeover of the police station in Glina, and 50 years after the 1941 massacres in Glina's Orthodox Church, local Serb political leaders issued the following statement, which they directed at their Croat neighbors and to Croat political leaders. And it's worth quoting from this statement at length. These are their words. Exactly 50 years ago, the Ustašas of the independent state of Croatia carried out a notorious massacre inside Glina's Orthodox Church. 1,500 people were slaughtered in this sacred space, a crime the world never before witnessed. For 50 years, the Serbian people forgave this crime, but they never forgot it. This year, on July 26, 1991, in honor of their victims, who were killed innocently in Glina's Orthodox Church, because they were Serbs and because they were Orthodox, a commemoration was held in Glina, which resembled nothing done before. The Serbian people, who never forgot their victims of the Ustašas and their crimes, have now thrown out and will continue to throw out a generation of new Ustašas who have come to Glina. This kind of commemoration does not resemble what used to take place, but it is necessary and it is just, and has been done in the name of 1,500 people who were slaughtered in this church It was done in the name of 500 well-known Serbs who were arrested and killed on one night in May 1941. And it was done in the name of hundreds of Berghouses and many black headscarves, which had been worn in sorrow by our mothers. Do you not yet understand why the Serbian people are ready to fight and give their lives? End quote. If Serbs could be thought of as martyrs in 1941, they would now use violence in 1991 to ensure that that experience would never, ever be repeated. And during the next 4 years, in supposed defense of their communities and lives, in the name of their victims in 1941, these Serb rebels in Glina would kill 387 of their Croat neighbors. They would destroy 33 of their villages, from which they expelled thousands of residents. While they committed this violence, which they justified in large part by reference to the memories of their relatives and neighbors who were killed in 1941, they worked to physically enshrine their memories of that terrible year in front of Glina's Remembrance House. Many of their renovations to the site, which the council I described a few moments ago had proposed, were unveiled on the day when this photograph was taken, July 30th, 1995. As you can see on the far left, members of the Serbian Orthodox Church were there, and they led the ceremony. The church's patriarch expressed his wish for peace for both the Serbian people and, as he called them, their enemies. The horrible crimes in Glina during 1941, he said, cannot ever be forgotten. The president of Glina's municipality directed the crowd of hundreds to look at the many plaques which were lining both sides of the plaza, which contained the names of those killed in 1941. Their memory, he said, should provide those today with the strength to hold their territory and defend their town from the Croats. And this strange scene of a community recalling its victims from a series of massacres half a century earlier, while using their memory to justify contemporary violence, and the imperative to commit more violence in the future if necessary, would last through the end of this solemn day and for about one more week. On August 6, 1995, the Croatian army fought its way into Glina and retook the town after more than 4 years of occupation by the Serb rebels. Members of the Croatian military soon took decisions which can help quickly bring our story back to the present day. An order was given while the fight for Glina was still ongoing to remove all objects built illegally during the Serbian occupation. And this order set the stage for the destruction of all the changes that we see here to the Remembrance House. Croatian soldiers arrived and they smashed the plaques of all the names of the Serbian victims. They took away the sculpture, which symbolized the entrance to the Orthodox Church. 3 weeks later, on September 23rd, 1995, Glina's newly constituted municipal council decided to rename the Remembrance House Hrvatski Dom, or Croatian House. And this is what it is still called to this day. It is what I noted on my first visit to Glina nearly 20 years ago, which brings us to our final scene. And in a sense, it returns us back to where we began. And so I wondered on my first visit, long before I knew really any of this history that I just recounted to you, how is it possible that on this place where a Serbian Orthodox Church had once stood, and where extreme Croatian nationalists had massacred people whom they categorized as Serbs in 1941, could be called today Hrvatski Dom? The story I've tried to tell you explains why. None of us should be surprised that after 4 years of war between 91 and 95 in Glina and its surrounding region, with hundreds of people categorized as Croats murdered, with thousands of them forced from their homes, and with more than 30 of their villages destroyed to the foundations, there is no desire in Glina today among Croats to recall the Ustasha violence against Glina Serbs in 1940. Is this approach to remembering the violent past offensive to some, such as those Serbs who still live in Glina today, as well as others in Croatia? Of course it is. But is this position nonetheless understandable if we endeavor to see the world through the eyes of those who insist on silencing this violent past? I would answer again, of course it is. These answers suggest that those who care about remembering the violent past in this part of Europe have been and remain deeply opposed to each other. After 1945, the communists sought to silence the ethnic dimensions of the massacres in Glina to promote brotherhood and unity. Serb-minded communists and nationalists rightly wanted to break this decades-long silence. Yet when finally given the opportunity, they used the memory of this violence as a justification to unleash their own violence in 1991. Croatian nationalists, in reaction to the violent Serb rebellion between 91 and 95, have sought to silence the memory of the massacres of 1941 from the end of the war in Croatia in 1995 until today, or through today. All of the historical actors in this story, on first glance, appear completely different. And what they want to remember seems radically different. And this helps explain why histories in this part of Europe continue to be told in highly selective ways, with the supporters of each group telling only the stories they want to hear, while ignoring and silencing the stories of others. In this sense, they vividly exemplify the words of the Vietnamese American scholar and novelist Viet Thanh Nguyen, who has written the following memorable sentences in his study of the memory of the Vietnam War. Quote, "All wars are fought twice. The first time on the battlefield, the second time in him." But I wonder if we might be able to retell this history of violence, silence, and memory in Glina in a way that might hold the potential to transcend this sense of never-ending conflict. When I tell this story, and when I think about what it means, what stands out to me are actually not the differences among the various groups and their deeply opposed memories. Rather, it is their striking similarities. The actors involved seem to me less like enemies and more like brothers, as members of the same family. To me, they look like people who, despite their vastly different historical experiences, their different views of the past and present, and their different political ideologies, have nonetheless behaved in strikingly similar ways when it comes to remembering the violent past. All of these actors are deeply concerned with what Nguyen has called the basic dialectic of memory and amnesia. In his words, this means, quote, remembering our humanity and forgetting our inhumanity, while conversely remembering the inhumanity of others and forgetting their humanity, end quote. In doing so, none of these groups have the slightest interest in fostering what Nguyen has called a just memory, which means a view of the violent past in which we acknowledge that, quote, the human inhabits the inhuman, both in the people whose stories we tell and in us, since we are no different. Fostering a just memory would seem to entail the imperative to renounce a memory of the violent past as based on mutually exclusive myths, and instead choosing to embrace one characterized by mutually coexisting truths. It may not be possible to reconcile these often painful and opposing truths, but creating a just memory demands that they be acknowledged. So in the end, this story of the space of wind, or the space where the church once stood in Glina, raises a series of questions which challenge all of us to think again about how we set limits around what in the violent past can be remembered and what must be silenced. Can we recall our terrible losses, yet still acknowledge the losses of others? including those with whom we may have been and perhaps still are in conflict? Can we see ourselves as victims and as people who may have victimized others? Can we see those others who have hurt us also as people whom we may have hurt? Nguyen argues in his work that our likely answer to these questions, no, suggests a pessimistic view of the future when it comes to the challenge of fostering a just memory of the violent past. As he writes, when we say always remember and never forget, we usually mean to always remember and never forget what was done to us and our friends and our allies. Of the terrible things that we have done or condoned, the less said and the less remembered, the better. More than this, what we really wish to remember and never forget is our humanity and the inhumanity of others. And yet, when we look at the story of Glina, and when we consider those involved more as brothers than enemies, we catch a glimmer of light emanating from the darkest corner of the violent past. And it may shine toward the future, inviting us to see not an endless and pessimistic cycle of violence and silencing, but rather what may be the slim potential to transcend this dynamic. In discovering that all of these seemingly deeply opposed historical actors have behaved in such similar ways, both as human and inhuman, as both victims of deafening silences and as those who have silenced others, we discover what can help us to approach this painful history anew. We are hurt and want desperately to remember our losses, and we refuse to acknowledge how we hurt others and cause their loss. And we can acknowledge, however little we can, that those others feel the exact same way. In that acknowledgement, whether we realize it or not, we turn and we take a step away from the endless cycle of silencing, which is our way of endlessly fighting the war over memory. In that acknowledgement, we allow that glimmer of light to show us, if only for a fleeting moment, the sparkling potential of a world in which a new memory of the violent past can rise on a foundation of mutually coexisting truths. I'll stop there. Thanks.
Open the discussion, and I hope there are already some issues to discuss and deep discuss better. So I don't know if our audience online would like to join us in this manner. I'm inviting everyone to ask questions. Perhaps for a warm up, I would start from asking you about something I would like to know, and I don't. Namely, this metaphor of place of site of wind suggests certain dynamics to not only the emptiness and this taking the place over by nature but also to me it suggests some dynamic dimension of the site. And I thought that I would like to know what's that demographic. So you mentioned the Serbs made today, also in the past. So could you perhaps guide us a bit? So how was the population? How the population was structured in the 40s? Then what happened after the first wave of massacres? Did Serbs emigrate after in the 40s, like looked for a safer place? Did they return? You mentioned the empty houses. You mentioned that some profited from the massacres. Then we have the state of Yugoslavia that allows probably the safe return. And then there is the migration waves from Yugoslavia to the West for different reasons. And then there are the 90s, and also the dynamic change in demographics, and the current situation where Croatia is taking over the site and forces, as far as I know, to tell us how it looked, forces the Serb population to emigrate. So how these waves look like, and this is important, I think, because looking at cases I know related to Jewish population in Poland, it is important from where the victims start their claims. Are they living on the site of massacres? Are they like formulating their claims for this just memory from the place they emigrated, but still within the same state? So we are still the same, but there could be certain we designed, or are they formulating these claims from abroad? Is it the first, second, or third generation that formulates these claims? Who are the alliance, so the allies? So who supports these claims with some imported or designed elsewhere formulas for reconciliation or commemoration? So it's in our local case, it will be different. You could imagine different claims when they come from American Jews, those who immigrate to America, those who immigrate to Israel, those who stayed. These claims will be slightly different. So how these Serbian claims look like? So what's the dynamics of demographics, and how this dynamics of demographics of population actually translates into dynamic of this commemoration claims?
It's great set of questions, and it was the writing the lecture was tricky because there's always a question of time, and I think I probably went too long anyway. But those are all very important pieces of information that could have been included and certainly would need to be included in the book. So just to address, if I can, and hopefully address all of your points, in terms of demography. Up until the massacres in 1941, Glina is very much a mixed town. So the population isn't necessarily 50-50, but it's close, right? So it's very much a Catholic and Orthodox town in terms of positions in positions of influence from politics to hospitals to schools. There is not a tradition or a history of one group dominating the other in Glina. And so very much a mixed town. After the Second World War, there is a significant return of Serbs to Glina, and in fact, this has lots to do with the way in which the partisan movement developed. Right, so because the communists were a multi-ethnic movement, but in Croatia and in particular in Serbia, they were overwhelmingly Serb, and that is in large part explained because the Ustaša persecution targeted Serbs, and so they could either be victims or they could fight. And so many of them moved to the communist ranks, and so they came back into these towns as political leaders, as members of the police, as people of influence. So in spite of these massacres, the return of the population is significant, and they held a significant amount of power. So across Croatia, let's now move to the late 1980s, 1990s, Serbs made up about 12 to 15% of the Republic of Croatia's population. So, but in places like Glina, it was somewhere close to 60%, and its wider region. So the Serbian population is large and is influential. And in some ways, as it was pointed out later on by Croatian minded national thinkers, that they were overrepresented in key parts of the power structure. There is also a diaspora of people who were forced out of the region during the Second World War, who established themselves in places like Belgrade, like this painter and this sculptor have links to the region, but they spent almost their entire adult lives. They came to Belgrade as children of refugees, but maintained their links to the region and traveled back regularly. And Krković didn't just design these proposals in the 1980s, he also helped to design ideas for the Remembrance House in the 1960s. So there was a strong sense in the Glina diaspora within Yugoslavia, much of which was in Belgrade and other parts of Serbia in particular, and some parts of Croatia, that they wanted to stay close and connected to their region. There's also a diaspora in Canada and the United States. And it's from those groups that the members of the Serbian Orthodox Church in Glina and other villagers and residents gathered around the church were able to come up with the money to rebuild the church. So they were able to get the approval from the communist authorities, but they received no funding And in fact, the local communist authorities even made it difficult for them to obtain materials. Their ally, in a sense, the card they held in their pocket was they were able to bring their claims about wanting to rebuild the church outside Yugoslavia and obtain funds from these communities. But those communities gave the money, but the people with the people on the ground who built the church and who made the decisions about the altar, as far as I've been able to determine, were local people. And so in the 1990s, this region becomes almost entirely Serbian, because the Serb rebels carry out, as I pointed out, a massive ethnic cleansing campaign. So this becomes a Serb region. When the Croatian military come back in August 1995, the opposite takes place. The vast majority, if not the entire Serbian population, flees. There are some killings, but most people fled in advance of the Croatian army. And so when I started doing my research in Glina in 2005 and 6, the town was deserted, in large part because this massive part of the population that was forced out never came back and was neglected purposely by the Croatian government to make it an unattractive place to return to. And so that's why so many of the buildings are abandoned. So the Serbian population today is probably, you could count them, percentage-wise, and probably less than one hand. So it's a very small number of Serbs. And so those in Croatia who feel that the name of the building should be changed back to Spomen Dom, there's a small number in Glina that feel this way, but it's mostly those gathered in the political party, which is the Serbian National Council, which represents the Serbian minority, which is a very small part of Croatia's population. So that explains in large part why the situation there is probably not going to change anytime soon, and probably never. So those are some of the demographic changes that I think were relevant in terms of your questions. So if I left something out.
Thank you. Let's open the discussion then, to public and the online public.
Okay, follow-up question regarding the migration from the period of social Yugoslavia. I was trying to connect it to the idea I suggested in the end about mutually coexisting truths. And while the inscription was rather elusive, but also at some point pointed out to very strong connotations. The words Ustaša nine, Ustaša no, so it brings, evokes some probably oral histories, probably things that couldn't be said, but they were retold even in the period of Yugoslavia. So I was wondering, insofar it was bring. It could start, it could provoke existence of those mutually existing truths in those allusions and untold places. Probably.
I think this was the great challenge that the communist authorities faced, not just in Glina, but across all the regions where this type of violence had taken place. And the violence took different forms depending on the region. The challenge was somehow to acknowledge the victims that could be politically acknowledged, right? So Ustaša victims could be acknowledged in socialist Yugoslavia because they fit into the category of victims of fascist terror. So Ustašas could be identified as fascists, so these victims could be acknowledged. The problem or the challenge was to somehow do that acknowledgement without also increasing what the communists called the basis for chauvinism, which essentially is nationalism rather than retention. So the word Ustaša could be used, and even maybe the word killing or the word slaughter. In this case, knife was used, but the adjective that connected to an ethnic group, which was considered to be a constitutionally enshrined nationality, which had equal rights and was supposed to be part of the brotherhoods in the brotherhood and unity, there was always great care to make sure there was no antagonism or kind of collective guilt placed on the shoulders of those people. And I think, from the perspective of the communists, that was, from what they were trying to accomplish, that was probably could be considered certainly logical and perhaps even smart, depending on how you want to make sense of it. The problem with that is that for survivors and others who were affected directly and indirectly by these massacres, that's not enough. They somehow wanted, or for various reasons, wanted a more direct approach to identifying the perpetrators. And so I think, the communists walk this line of trying to promote their own version of truth without making too much space for others. Or if they did, for example, the mass grave in the cemetery, what's interesting about that is they allowed that to be built, and it was explicit. They didn't use the word Croatian, or the adjective Croatian was not used, but the victims were identified as Serbian sons and daughters, right? But of course, this was a space where they didn't expect different ethnic groups to be interacting with each other, and where the message was confined in many ways to one particular group in the same way that a church was a place for one particular group, or a mosque, or another religious organization. And so all of that was permitted in Yugoslavia. So I think in that sense, I see the communists at this point in my research as involved in creating their own exclusive myth. And I don't say that as a form of judgment to say, what they did necessarily was wrong. I see it as a logical outgrowth of their political objectives and in their kind of moral and ideological view of the world. This is what they wanted to accomplish. And so in doing so, I see them as, in a sense, the first practitioners of a deafening silence. What I see, however, is that as we look at this history over its various waves, I don't see them as having a monopoly of creating silence. That's why I have this idea that at this point they seem kind of like brothers. This is maybe the provocative side of the research, to say the communists, the Serbian nationalists of the 1990s, and the Croatian nationalists from 95 to today, I see them as operating with the same mindset in many ways, not as diametrically opposed to each other, even though what they say should be remembered and what they say should be silenced is fundamentally different. And that's what I'm trying to really think through, because I think much of this history in various kind of shaved off chunks is known in Croatia, but presenting it in the way that I just sketched out, that may not sit well with people, but that's what historians should do, right? We're there to not provoke needlessly, but to try and get people to think in ways they might not have before. So that's where I feel like the mutually coexisting truths comes in, especially when we look at it over the long term. The communists I see much more as a practitioner of their own particular set of myths, which they modified to some extent over time, but stayed remarkably consistent with up until they lost monopoly over political late 80s, early 90s.
So thank you, and who would like to continue?
I have a question. So I'm very curious what will follow the case of Glina. I suppose you have some other cases with totally different ethnic configurations, yeah? And I'm wondering about more visual and artistic documentation of your research, because the project you're showing us with this bloody floor,
Yeah,
is shocking.
it is. That's why I put it in the presentation, because
It's strong, aggressive, and confrontational. That I'm wondering if you have any another examples, maybe from, I don't know, Croatian victims, are there any project similar in this aggressiveness to this one? Because when you showed it, I started to think that this visual project and archives are kind of potential history with the meaning against the meaning as we introduced, a totally opposed vision, not realized in place. And yeah, Yeah, it's shocking. So I wonder if you have another materials and how do you read it? How do you compare?
If I could just ask, because I'm really intrigued by something you said at the end, if I could just ask, before I answer your question, which of course I will, but I have a question. When you mentioned like an unrealized, kind of potential history, tell me a little bit more what you mean by that. In the case of the proposed remembrance.
Yeah, because I started to think about many other artistic projects of commemoration during the communist periods from Poland, like the road from the Oskar Hansen, and there's also some unrealized project of Bogdan Bogdanovich, which were more complicated than realized projects. It is unrealized in the sense, in material sense, yeah, because in I don't know, historical sense, they are materialized in the violence during the 90s war, yeah. But this is a very big archive of, not realized opportunities, very aggressive and not, very aggressive and nationalist, yeah. So this is a kind of the history which didn't happen, but this kind of history is against this very very reconciliative version of potentializing history of Aryan civilization.
I understand better what you mean now. It's a way that she would not want that concept to be used.
Yeah.
But in a sense, it's actually a very interesting way to think about it, because every group, I think if I take seriously the ideas that I'm trying to advocate for, what that means is, it's not how I think people should think about the past, that it's how they should be free to practice their truth, how they need to.
Yeah.
And that means maybe a floor that is red, right? That may be exactly that's their truth that needs to be placed out there with other truths. And what I'd be arguing for is that those stories, in telling those stories and putting them together and not looking for a resolution.
Okay.
My view is that's where the potential history is, because while people may be offended, while people may be shocked, that strikes me as really the only way forward in societies like this. Finding one single solution where certain things are elevated while others are not seems a way to be, seems like the obvious thing to do, and yet always continues this cycle of silence.
Okay.
So I think, but what I find intriguing in what you're suggesting is that for the people who created that model, Čubrić and Krković, and anyone who would look at it and say, I love this, I want this built, that for them, that is a version of realizing potential history, right? Because it's bringing forward a set of truths, which I call in my talk today, not just historical, but emotional, into a kind of giving them kind of a physical tangibility, right? Like making them into objects that exist in the world, and therefore taking what they feel grievance about and essentially putting it out into the world and feeling that grievance is perhaps not taken away.
Yeah.
And so in this sense, the concept of potential history leads in directions that, people who kind of practice truth and reconciliation and human rights may not like.
Yeah.
But I guess that's one of the bigger ideas to think about in terms of, what's the ultimate, provocation of this book project? Is it that, mutually coexisting truths means that people who feel extremely hurt may also have to consider truths that will hurt them further?
Yeah, because this project is hurting.
Yeah.
Literally.
Like looking at the red floor is hurting, but then for Serbs walking in Glina and seeing Hrvatski Dome, that is also painful.
Yeah.
And seeing the Spomen Dome with a plaque that is inaccurate in the view of the people, that is also, so it's a very important thing to think through, which is why I'm intrigued with this project, but I also feel like it will offend everyone in some ways. But To come back to your question though about other examples, I don't think I've ever seen a model, which doesn't mean they don't exist, of what I just showed you. It's not a type of research I spend a lot of time doing. So I mean, I actually, in 2006, I went to Krković's studio in Belgrade and interviewed him. And what was fascinating to me is that, you know, he was a sculptor and a very important one during, when I interviewed him, he was like in his mid 80s. And so he had this massive studio in Belgrade, and there were pictures and designs of monuments like everywhere. And he was a very important sculptor during the time of communism, but all of the models that I saw in his studio were for Serbian fighters from the wars in Bosnia, in Republika Srpska from 92 to 95. And so he had designed for that entity in Bosnia and Herzegovina many of the monuments that would probably fall into what you would call, you know, other examples of like shocking monuments. Now, those monuments don't include, like, this to me was the more extreme one I've ever seen. But what makes a lot of those monuments striking is that some of them are abstract, some of them are more lifelike, but they generally include monuments to what are called Srpski borci, ili Srpski heroi, so Serbian heroes, Serbian fighters who defended their people in the fatherland war. And these monuments are placed in places where, you know, in 92, like hundreds, and in some places thousands of Muslims were killed. Like civilians did not throw the first punch or shoot at all. And so what makes those monuments shocking is that they depict like a war, in quotation marks, where the most important violence that took place was actually those people depicted murdering civilians, which is not talked about at all.
Yeah.
And so if you go around Republika Srpska, you can see some of Krković's monuments, and I find them shocking because they at the same time, they propose a kind of version of historical truth, at least to him, as well as the political leaders, and probably more than a few people living in those communities, that is in a sense what they want. And so, you know, the ideas I'm toying with are in that sense, you know, could potentially be very offensive if taken to kind of their logical conclusion. I tend to find something hopeful in them, but you know,
it's really interesting,
Yeah.
your method, because I guess it would be very fruitful, and it's kind of original, confronting such strong materials and stories from other sides in one narration.
I mean, it's a very incendiary topic, right? So this is not these histories. So the communist period, you know, if you talk about Glina during the time of communism, at least for the Serbian community, it's a time of liberation. And also for Croats as well, they felt like they were under the thumb of Serbs, who also felt they were under the thumb of Serb communists. So it's kind of thought of as a time of repression and silencing. Then if you talk about the war from 91 to 95, that is a time where Croats were murdered in high numbers, and also Serbs also, in retrospect, see that as a time when they lost their community in Croatia, where they had to.
Yeah, in this area.
So I mean, it's a very fraught history, whichever period you confront it with. In terms of like a further research on this time, you know, these type of memorials, I'm not sure what my next project is going to be at this point. You know, I'm always attracted to subjects that seem to have a lot of potential to tell us something new that haven't been studied very much. And I guess that's a good way to think about research. So two things that have caught my attention. One is the Muslim civil war that took place in northwest Bosnia during the war from 92 to 95 in Bosnia. And so that's a very understudied conflict.
Yeah.
That was extremely brutal, and I think can tell us a lot about the nature of you know, ethnic conflict in quotation marks. So that's one potential project. The other one that I'm closer to working on is also, will probably get myself in a lot of trouble. So I taught a course about a year and a half ago to first-year undergraduates called A Late 20th Century Genocide, The Killings in Srebrenica, 1995. So the course is on 1 week of history, July 1995. And I assigned the students mostly documents from the International Criminal Tribunal for former Yugoslavia. So one testimony we read is by a protected witness. He's called Protected Witness 101. And he was a support staff, support staff for a group of Serbian soldiers who were charged one day with carrying out mass executions. And his job was to bring them juice and cookies. So when they got tired of killing people, they had something to eat. And so during one of the executions, they kill 30, 40, 50 people, and all of a sudden there's a voice in the pile of bodies saying, "Daddy, Daddy, Daddy." And his 6-year-old child stands up. And the leader of the group of executioners says to the soldiers, "Finish him." And all of a sudden, the soldiers who had done all this killing stop. And they say, "We won't do it." Just like an incredible moment to just take in. And so the support staff person eventually takes this child who's in shock to a hospital. And he survived. And he's like in his early 30s right now. So he's alive today. And so there's something about that moment. In our course, we talked about it, came back to it again and again. We read many documents, but this was a moment we came back to, trying to make sense of this moment. And so I'm thinking of trying to write an article or maybe even something bigger that I call uncomfortable evidence. These are moments in the middle of genocidal violence that don't fit into the usual questions we ask, that don't work with our moral universe, that are usually used by victim or perpetrator groups for an easy kind of agenda, whereas to the historian, there's something important that happens there that most people who are in control of the telling and remembering of this history would refuse the investigation.
Amazing.
So I want to take that moment. There's a few others which I won't recount now, that I feel like there's something big there, because that history has been told by the court. And it's very much told, to come back to the topic of this research program, it's very much told through the eyes of memory activists, right? Memory activists are in control of Srebrenica. And you know what? They should be. I get that. But that's not my job. Like, that's not my job. And I'm not there necessarily to make anyone happy. I'm there to ask hard questions and come up with answers that somehow advance, the world that I operate in, and hopefully will be useful to others. So I feel like between the courts and the memory activists and their allies in academia, that event, it's been very hard to investigate that event in new ways. The books that have come out about it, there aren't many, strike me as reading like expert reports for the court.
Yeah.
Right? And so it's like in a moment like that, the class really showed me, because the students had these amazing questions, because they came to this like not knowing anything about Bosnia, not knowing anything about Srebrenica, and posed these interesting questions. So my work may move away finally from this kind of 1940s period. So I mean, this project itself moves into the 1990s. That's something new for me. My first book was really on 41, and then through the 1960s. So this is I'm taking on a lot of new terrain here. But I'm thinking that might be a direction to go in, but that won't make me many friends. I think work like that. But I guess that's not so much a piece of visual evidence that is so shocking, but the moment itself has a similar kind of shock value to it. That within that moment, you either can be shocked and quickly make meaning of it, or you can investigate it carefully and hopefully come up with some new findings that are really path-breaking. So that's the direction I always try to move. Great set of questions. Thanks.
Thank you. I see Karina, thanks.
Yes. Hi there. Sorry for not being with you on site today. You hear me, right? Everything works. Okay, so I have a kind of follow-up to what you've just said, because I'm interested, among other things, about the like style that you conveyed today, your research to us, the storytelling manner that you experiment with, as you explained to us a little bit today earlier during the seminar. So you also said in this discussion that you ask yourself the question of how the history should be told, why, and how to do it to accomplish specific goals. And I'm, as I am now in my own research, very much into like epics as a literary genre. That's why I also mentioned the Iliad today. And I'm listening, while listening to you, I'm just thinking that the epics, not only the Iliad, many of those kind of long poems and well, storytelling kind of form that is supposed to represent the like some community as a whole and so on and so forth. They are often like placing the conflict in the middle of the story. And as you are using these methods to present the conflicted past or violent past and violence in general, I'm thinking, would you agree that this storytelling form suits best this specific kind of past that you are now researching, right? Would you use the same method of presenting your research if you would be researching, I don't know, the history of work or some other less violent past? Yeah, that's maybe my question. Thanks.
That's a great question. Yeah, thanks for being here, even from home, and thanks for that great question. It's a tough story to try and figure out how to tell, because stories are best told when there's a nice narrative arc, rising action to some kind of climax, and it's usually best told when there's some set of vivid, multi-dimensional characters that can drive the story forward. And I'm not at a place in my research where I've identified the people that I can use to propel the story forward. I have some, but I don't have enough. I haven't done enough research to really identify. My goal would be to somehow find certain characters that can some way live throughout this long period of time, this nearly half century, that show up again at the various points of the story. So how I thought about telling the story today was through these scenes. Taking us into these moments in time and stringing them together in a way that would in a sense, compensate for not having the people, the sufficient numbers of people that I would need to drive the story forward. I think the scenes themselves, the visuals, as well as what's taking place before, during, and around those moments is sufficiently dramatic that I was able to, my sense is that it still worked well enough even without, the essential human element or the sufficient level of human element. Violence and conflicts over how to remember violence, if that story ends up being boring, there's either a real big lack of sources or the historian is somehow boring, right? So you already have a very dramatic story to tell kind of just with the subject choice. If someone's telling the story of, textiles in a factory somewhere, that story might present greater challenges in terms of its telling. But in theory, what I learned, I was just teaching a seminar this past term, another course on storytelling. One of the books we read was on, the conflicts between the United States and the Soviet Union in the Bering Sea over the hunting of whales and walruses and foxes. And so that historian, one of her innovations was to try and tell the history of these conflicts through the perspective of like whales, right? So some of the scenes are literally about how the whales learned, how to evade boats that were coming to kill them and how they changed, their migration patterns. And so she empowered these animals, these non-human subjects, to be characters in the story. And it was super innovative, evocative, and she was able to create scenes. She talked about the natural world in this way that made you feel like you were there in the water with the animals and the sailors and all of the others. And so what it made me think was that if you're actually interested in telling a story, any story can be told with drama. One doesn't need violence or the memory of violence to do it. I think certain stories are more easily told, but I think it's a question of of thinking about what's the action, what's the dramatic action you want to convey to your reader. what are the scenes? What is the place? How do you draw readers into feeling like they are there and can get a sense of the emotion and the difficulty and the challenges that people at that time were facing, whether it's about violence or about work. So in this sense, I think some of the things I'm trying to use right now are kind of generic, like they can be applied in different ways, depending on whether the scholar doing the writing wants to think less about writing like a journal article and more about telling a story that nonetheless has a set of findings that are useful to scholars. I think that's the kind of way, I literally feel like the last few years I'm trying to unlearn my training, my way that I think like a book or an article has to be written. And that's hard because journals only want certain kinds of articles, or book publishers will only publish certain kinds of books. But I think at the end of the day, readers, what I've learned, outside since I become a professor, is that when you publish a book, a reader who buys your book can put it down whenever. They're not like a reader for a journal. They're not a member of your dissertation committee. They don't actually have to read. So if you don't have a good story, if you don't have some kind of conflict and challenge, the reader will be lost quickly. You might never get them back. I think that's one of the reasons why the storytelling is is very much front and center for me right now.
There is this literary theorist, Marta Nussbaum, maybe you are familiar with her, and she has this great piece about how the novel, the plot of the novel can be a medium of evoking sense of responsibility in the reader for the co-citizens and so on and so forth. So yeah, that was partly my question. If while dealing with ethically delicate matters, it is maybe even more important to make a dramatic account of it, to make your reader feel accountable or responsible somehow for dealing with the past and the future and the memory of the events and so forth. Yet, as you were telling now about the whales and other history subjects, I just thought that we may be willing to evoke responsibility not only for co-citizens but also for co-habitants of the earth and many other living and maybe even not living actors of the social life. So yeah, thank you very much.
Absolutely. Just to follow up on that, I think the great challenge in telling history or telling a story and telling history is that how do you take something like mass violence, to come to my research, the memory of it, which for many people across the world is, for many people it's something that they know quite well. For many others, it's something very foreign. Not many people have lived in a place like Glina and have experienced this type of violence. How do you make that world seem human and not like some other planet, right? And so I think all of the kind of techniques of having the characters appear like us and having the place seem like something that we can smell and can sense and can imagine ourselves walking through, all of that matters to bring the reader in so that those two worlds don't seem so different. And then the other one, I think, is that the challenges that those people are facing are also all of our challenges, right? So something I did at the end of this lecture, which may have been weird, was switching again, to kind of the first person plural. But it's something that I don't know if I decided this in a technical way. It was more just happened while I was writing, that this is the shift that I made that felt right to me. That either works for people or it doesn't, but it's something, I think what I'm actually trying to achieve, what I think about listening to your question, is that the more I research these stories, the more I feel like I learn about what it is to be a human being. Not for those people only to be human beings, but for me as well. And that challenge of realizing that there are not just people who act in a humane way and people who act in an inhumane way, but that those things usually coexist within people. I also feel like I'm learning that about me. And I feel like one of the lessons, the more stories can actually involve people in these kind of universal lessons, the more engaging they tend to be, right? And this is also something that occurs to me. I'm writing now as a parent. When I wrote my first book, I didn't have children. So now I do. And I spend a lot of time reading stories to my kids. And there are stories that they won't listen to, like 1 or 2 pages in, they get bored. And there are others that they ask me to read again and again and again and again. And the ones that they usually want so many times have some kind of conflict. They teach us some lesson about, you know, what it is to be a kind of person in the world. Those seem to grab their attention. And so, you know, it makes me think that there is a kind of, you know, almost like generic sense of like what constitutes a good story. It takes, you know, really different forms depending on what you're researching. But there are certain stories that people grab onto and others that they don't want to hear about again. And so, you know, teaching readers or listeners about, you know, some essential aspect of what it is to be a human being in the world seems like an important element to have in mind. Like one of the things that came up in our seminar when we read these books, it's a question I've never asked in a class before. I would ask the students, how does this author want to change the world? Not, you know, just what they're arguing, who they're arguing against, what their theories, but like, how do they want the world of the readers to be different and usually better in some way? And it seemed like all of these works of history that were such profound stories, the author always seemed to have some agenda in that area. And I think my first book had that. I just don't think I thought about it. I think I'm just thinking about it more now. So I mean, this book may fail miserably because of these new ideas, but they're keeping me interested right now. And I think, you know, intuition, like what you feel like is the best way forward, like that has to be the guiding light going forward. Right? Not what this person does or what that professor says, but like what occurs to you as a writer, as a historian, as a literary scholar, how the story can be told according to like what makes sense to you. That's what I'm learning more about myself, to listen more closely to that. So just a few ideas in response to your thoughts. Thanks.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for the questions. Thank you for the answers. That's we overstayed our plans a bit, and this is probably the moment for the very last question. If someone has some very urgent issue to ask, I'm not discouraging this last question. On the contrary, I would like to hear it before we ask the voice for Canada.
Yeah.
So it's last opportunity. So if there is none, there will be probably a few moments here in this room to ask one personal question. And I would like to thank you for today, for staying with us for such a long time in the midday tonight, and showing us this possibility of different history writing, of different memory analysis from this. I think like a cinematic point of view cameras that like zoom in, zoom out, and allow us to see that very like a close reading of a situation, and then zooming out to read these reverberations that come up as an aftermath of the violence, and consider us as researchers, as visitors to these societies, as observers or even members of these societies. So this was kind of a writing lesson and moral lesson as well. So the challenges of academics were also included and gave me a lot to think of. So thank you for leaving me with so many questions and like open doors to new avenues that I would like to take. So thank you for this visit, and I will stay in touch. And as you are present in the Research Center for Memory Cultures before you came here, you will be present in the years to come. So
Thank you so much for the invitation, and also just to say once again, the invitation pushed me to sit down and take the opportunity to try to tell the story, kind of where I am right now, and also learn about like who I'm becoming as a scholar, which has changed from last year and even half a year ago. And so when I had finished the first draft of this, I got on my bike and rode off to teach. And I thought to myself how like the previous days of working were like this year for me. So the invitation to do this was a great gift to me, not just to come here and do it, but just to work itself on it. So I just been immensely grateful to you for your generosity and for everyone for coming tonight. So thank you.
Thank you. So thank you those who joined us. Karina.
Nice to meet all of you.
Bye.
Thanks again. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you very much.
Good night.
Great meeting you.